Greetings. Welcome to this panel entitled Heroes of the Global South and Heroes in quotation marks, Labor Migration in Comparative Perspective. My name is Karen Engel. I teach at the law school at UT and co-direct the Rappaport Center with Neville Hode. Kamran Ali will be officially chairing this panel and will step in very soon. He had an unexpected delay. But that means I get the great pleasure of introducing this panel, and which we are all very excited about. The panel marks in a way our turn, so we're in our third week of the Pop-Up Institute and the final week of public events. And the cluster around work across the Global South is sponsoring this meeting as well as a meeting tomorrow on the informal economy. But for those of you who have been with us, you know that we've been talking about work across the Global South in many, many different events. And this event is not only about work across the Global South, but actually intersects with all of our clusters in ways that I'm very excited about. So we will hear some of the ideas and themes around essential work reemerge, certainly around care work, future of the arts and artistic labor, as well as a little bit of AI and technology. So the interdisciplinary panel that we have here will explore comparative forms of labor migration across several geographies. So South Asia, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the United States. And we have a terrific group of scholars here to think critically through what we mean when we talk about low-waged migrant laborers as heroes or as they're in many ways have that cultural designation. And that comes from the fact that they are both vital sources of remittances as well as vital to the labor of the global economy. I'll just say a couple of words about the meeting before I introduce the panelists. This is a Zoom meeting, not a webinar, so we really do want to make sure that in the question and answer, we have a chance to engage with each other. You're welcome to have your cameras on or off. We do ask you to turn your microphones off. During the conversation, you should feel free to type comments in the chat. So some of our events have had a chat discussion going on, intersecting very much with what people are saying, but I can say that at least for myself, I'm not a great multitasker. And so not everyone will be expected to follow, but the panelists the panel chair will keep an eye on those questions. And now that's an issue. Why don't you send them to me if you have specific questions that you don't want to send to everyone, and I will make sure that Kamran Ali gets them when he arrives. If you're watching from YouTube, you can enter your questions in the YouTube chat, and we have a student team member watching that who will pass them on to me again, and I'll pass them on to Kamran. So finally, we're live tweeting the event, and you're welcome to join the conversation on Twitter. And I think someone has, I think Liza Scarborough has just put the link to Twitter there. Okay, so it's now my pleasure to introduce to you our panelists from sociology, anthropology, and ethnomusicology. And I will introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak, which is also alphabetical order. I will just say a word about them, and Liza will put the full bios in the chat. So our first speaker will be Hae Yeon Choo, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Toronto. She'll be speaking about labor migration from the Philippines to Korea, and particularly talking about factory workers and those who do hostess work. She'll be followed by James Gabrillo, who's an assistant professor of musicology and ethnomusicology. He will be focusing on Philippine caregivers in both New Jersey and in Milan. And he'll be talking to us about and perhaps even sharing with us soundscapes of their daily lives. After Professor Gabrillo, we'll hear from Rui Jie Peng, who is a PhD candidate in sociology here at the University of Texas. She's also a Rappaport Center affiliated graduate student. She will be actually talking about people who don't migrate in an economy of migration, talking about particularly members of ethnic minorities in China who stay at home, stay back rather than migrating. And finally, Andrea Wright, who is an assistant professor of anthropology at William and Mary, will be speaking about Indian labor migration, migrant workers who go from India to the Middle East to work on oil projects. So you can hear that we're going to cover a variety of geographies, of sectors, and hear about them from a number of different disciplines. So I'm very much looking forward to that. They'll each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion among them. So with no further ado, I turn it over to you, Hae Yeon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Karen, for the introduction, and thank you for the organizers to make this happen. I'm speaking from Toronto. It's a traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And in this time where I am in Canada, we're going through quite a challenging week. After the remains of 215 Indigenous children have been found in a residential school in BC last week, and we recently, just a few days ago, had a hate crime of Islamophobic hate crime that led to death of 4 Pakistani immigrant families. And in this time where we see so much different kinds of xenophobia, racism, and violence, I think it is a right time for us to really think through the question of the border, the question of settler colonialism that give basis to the kinds of the backlash against migration that we have. So I'm really thankful to have this space to talk about these very important issues that are quite at the top of our minds today. So the topic of my own research focuses on the labor migration from the Philippines to South Korea, but it's in part a part of this global temporary labor migration regime that extends from the Middle East, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and to North America and Europe as well. So the people that I've talked to, I've met the Filipino women and other Southeast and South Asian men and women. They have been part of this system of temporary labor migration as care workers in Hong Kong. They were factory workers in Taiwan. They were hostesses in Japan. So once they become part of the system, it definitely has certain kinds of order, but it's kind of a system where you stay in one country for a year or two, and when the contract expires, you don't have any rights in that country anymore, that you're either back or onto the next migrant destination. And in that system of temporary global migration, my focus was to look at what kinds of condition does that system produce. So, this system, it's a form of migrant exclusion, but it's a little bit different from kind of wholesale, you don't enter our country. It's different from that type of migrant exclusion, because in order for these migrant labor and for their essential, labor and bodies to be used, they need to be within the country. It's like if you say don't enter, then you cannot use their bodies in labor. So what comes with the system is you need them here, but at the same time, you don't want to give them full rights or full citizenship. So from that paradox of needing their bodies so much, but then you don't want to give them full citizenship. So from that paradox emerges what I put in my book as a condition of migrant containment. So you need their bodies, but you need to contain them in a particular way with the visa system, with the practice of immigration raids, with different type of control over which employers can have them, the limits on their mobilization. So from this system, what I researched in South Korea is how it leads to certain kind of borders and boundaries where the migrants, mainly from Southeast Asia and South Asia, they have certain idea of which area and which activities are permissible within that borders of the containment. So for example, when these immigration raids happen against undocumented migrants, but these kind of raids that also affect even documented migrants or kind of racial profiling type of way, naturalized citizens as well. But when those kind of immigration raids happen, it is often at the borders of migrant segregated neighborhoods where these factories, where these clubs exist. So these are the areas where everyone in South Korea, university students, regular citizens, including immigration raids, officers, they know where the migrants are. So it's kind of an open secret where you can go and, arrest undocumented migrants if they choose to do so. But because their labor is essential to the workings of South Korea, whether it's in the manufacturing sector or in other sectors, they don't arrest them wholesale. Instead, they police the borders of these migrant neighborhoods so that the migrants have certain areas where they feel relatively safe. As long as they are doing low-wage work, they are not making their rights claim. As long as they remain in this migrant segregated area and out of the public eye of a South Korean citizen, they are more or less safe. However, when you cross that boundary of a physical boundary and enter into an area where South Koreans and other like village markets, that's when you become the target of immigration raids. So that's a physical kind of border that this system produces and maintains. Other type of border is a social boundary of containment. So it's not just physical where you can go, but it's about what you can do. So when I was in the field observing who becomes the target of immigration raids, it's very interesting that when some people become a target of random raids, nobody, it becomes quite a question of among people that the debates go on for weeks, like why did they become a target? What would be the reason? Whereas when other people become a target, those who are involved in a political activism for migrant workers, those who join migrant trade union, when they become a target of immigration raids, which does happen quite often, then people all know what was the reason behind that. So the immigration raids operate not just a boundary policing of the physical area, but also what migrants are capable of doing, what kinds of rights and claims they can make in South Korea. So that's the kind of containment part. But the migrants and also South Korean advocates for the migrants, they have challenged that borders of containment for migrant workers for many decades. And the part that my comparative analysis focused on was why for the factory workers, migrant factory workers, there's a quite extensive level of labor advocacy, social advocacy. You see labor unions coming together, you see faith-based organizations coming together to improve their rights and for them to be able to exercise the labor rights they do have on paper. But why in the case of club workers, those who are working as hostesses, mainly for the American GIs who are stationed in South Korea around American military base towns. So for them, how come they have very similar legal status and similar accordant labor rights, but how come nobody's really coming to support them in the exercise over the labor rights that are quite different from the way that the South Korean civil society and unions have approached the factory workers? And there, my answer was that initially I thought it was more about the sexual morality of their work. How hostess work is often conflated with sex work, and that somehow limits the kind of advocacy. To some extent, that explanation held. However, what I found while talking to the workers and also the advocates was that the reason that the labor rights and the social rights of hostesses were not being advocated in a way that it was for factory workers is not so much of sexual morality per se, but more about how their work as a feminized work did not get the recognition as legitimate hard work that needs worker citizenship. So the advocates would say, not so much that the hostess work is immoral work, but more that it's easy work when compared to factory work that you risk getting your fingers cut. You cannot use people as a paper cup and throw away, because that is a legitimate line of work that people have fought for their rights. However, when it comes to hostess work, it was more like, oh, it's just a work that, you're just drinking, you're just singing. Even if you try to mobilize the hostesses, they wouldn't come. It was more in line with their lack of recognition as a feminized work that don't get the dignity of a working man. So the way that the hostesses were not considered as valuable, as essential, that very much is in line with whose work counts as a real work. And that, to kind of wrap up, to me recently, this question became, again, quite at the forefront when I started thinking about the anti-Asian violence that happened in Atlanta in March, when all the Asian, there was a lot of mobilization on the issues of anti-Asian racism and violence, which, very much was needed. But I think we can ask that question when we see this mobilization, how much of the voices and experiences of Asian immigrant women, working class women, are really being centered in there? We talk about the lives of massage workers when they're alive, not only when they're dead. And so those kind of questions of thinking about how the question of gender, the question of work, the question of essential legitimate work, how that still shapes the way that we advocate and we think about the dignity of workers and migrants is something I think is quite important today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very powerful. And thanks for connecting it to the more recent violence in Atlanta. Now I turn it over to James Gabrillo, and I forgot to say, I think that he's at the University of Texas at Austin. So.
Thanks, Karen. I forgot to say that I am sharing a few slides, so if I can be given access to do that, please, by the host. But in any case, I'm going to go. Oh, there you go. Thanks so much. Great. Thanks so much again. It's really an honor to be sharing my ethnomusicological work with you all today and with my excellent co-panelists. Just a very, very brief background. There are over 10 million Filipinos, or about a tenth of the country's population, linking to Professor Choo's research, based abroad, and they're typically referred to as OFWs. And this label confers status back home, a country that receives the most money in overseas worker remittances, alongside China and India. Since the 70s, Philippine government officials have promoted labor exploitation as a strategy for both relieving poverty and alleviating the national debt. Former Philippine President Corazon Aquino, who served in office from '86 to 1992, repeatedly praise overseas workers as bagong bayani, or the new heroes of the country. In 2001, with the Philippines still reeling from the Asian financial crisis, then Philippine President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo addressed overseas Filipino workers in a statement telling them, if you can find work there and send money, then perhaps you should stay there. And today, a tenth of the population works abroad, supporting nearly half of the country's households and leaving some 10 million Filipino children missing a parent. And according to 2018 data from the Philippine Overseas Employment Agency, in the past decade, 3/4 of overseas Filipino workers have been women. In the 70s and 80s, most Filipino migrants were men who worked in merchant shipping, construction, but since the 90s, migration has become increasingly by Filipino women. And the largest population of these OFWs are based here in the US, and many of them work as caregivers who typically live within their respective employers' households and are responsible for housekeeping, for providing care for children and or elderly dependents. There's this wonderful story from 2016 at the New Yorker where Maria Ibarra was interviewed, a professor at San Diego State University, and Professor Ibarra observed how mothers and daughters leave their families so they can do the type of quote unquote women's work, caring for the young, the elderly, the infirm, that perhaps women in affluent countries no longer want to do or have time to do. And Professor Ibarra considers these caregivers emotional proletarians in that they produce authentic emotion in exchange for a wage. And my ongoing project, I'm barely midway, but nonetheless, it utilizes a combination of observational, interview-based, but also sonic ethnography, that is simply audio recording. In the months preceding the pandemic, I've been spending a lot of time with caregivers in different cities, in person and virtually, observing and listening to their daily living and working environment. My ongoing case studies are based in New Jersey, Milan, London, Saudi Arabia, and Hong Kong. But crucially, my fieldwork has relied a great deal on the workers' help and generosity, as they use their own, some of them use their own recording devices available on their cell phones, and then record their soundscapes, hours and hours of sounds from their daily experiences, caring for their employers, cooking and cleaning, spending their downtime by themselves in complete silence, or with fellow workers during their days off, and communicating with their loved ones back home using this technology that we're using now, Skype, etc. This type of sonic ethnography, I hope it lays bare both the unorganized and fertile terrains of human experience, and perhaps disrupts idealized subjects of observer and subject, of researcher and case study. I worked as a journalist before going to grad school in the Middle East, where I found myself to be guilty of these fixed conceptions of the event, of the everyday, of the caregiver. And hopefully, as migrant caregivers are able to select physically and metaphorically which sounds to record from their lives, they're able to construct their own narratives that are presented to me and then here to the larger public. What sound recording has provided for my project is the convenience in terms of anonymizing my case studies, and such anonymization cannot easily be enacted through typical journalism work, audiovisual filming, photographic documentation. And just very quickly, these are sort of the three principal lines of inquiry that I'm currently working with. And that first theme, narratives of caregiving, I'm examining, the abundance, but also the lack of sounds in their living and working environments. In the case of caregivers who work with children, for example, their soundscapes are, as expected, characterized by interactions with kids, sounds of playing, sounds of crying. On the other hand, for caregivers who work with elderly dependents and are the sick, most of their days are spent in silence, since the home they work in is also the place where they live, presumably. Silence punctuated by sounds of feeding, cleaning, brief conversation. And in one of my case studies in New Jersey, a caregiver we'll call Ruby, she's currently working for an elder dependent, herself a migrant from the Middle East to America. And the recordings Ruby has shared with me features hours and hours of silence, usually going up to 5 to 8 hours, and then suddenly punctuated by sounds from her interactions with her employer, which often lasts for about a minute while she's changing the latter's clothing or cleaning food feeding food or taking medicines. And Ruby herself has to remain quiet throughout the day so as not to disturb the elderly dependent, thus the predominance of silence in her soundscape. And Ruby told me that during those many hours of silence, she often fantasized about what she would rather do with all that free time. This is quote from her. But for Ruby to succeed in her job, to be able to send money back home, she has to learn to practice a type of powerful displacement. She told me, I have to transfer that love and care to my employer's ear. In one standout recording that she shared to me, 6 hours of silence were broken by loud, sharp, high-pitched sounds of heavy-duty sticky tape being strip fastened and secured against flapping cardboard. And for the next hour, you hear footsteps in and out of the room, sounds of tinkered objects, paper bags, plastic. And it turned out that Ruby was organizing a balikbayan box of presents to be mailed back home, literally repatriate box. And it typically costs around $70 regardless of weight, to send the box through a Filipino-owned shipping company based in Jersey City. And it usually takes about 2 months to get to the Philippines by container ship. And Ruby told me that when she's bored, she works on organizing the box, and it reminds her why she's there. What I've also discovered in these recordings is how these caregivers have found a sense of release, physical, emotional, and yes, sonic, during their weekly day off from work, which is typically on a given Sunday. They usually meet up with fellow migrant workers where they spend hours and hours chatting, relaxing over food, going to church, where some of them participate in choirs, or through karaoke sessions in another migrant worker's house. And during these karaoke sessions, most of the tracks they perform are Filipino pop songs. And I think that's, as an aside, it's worth noting that a common thread in my case studies is that the local songs that they often choose to perform are those typically released or popularized during the years that they were about to leave the Philippines in search of a better life. That is, their chosen karaoke songs serving as a reminder of their lives back home prior to their employment overseas. The songs they listen to and sing today continue to shape their experiences, exemplifying how diasporic migrant identities may remain embedded in narratives of origin. And these identities are often articulated in musical performance and cultural display, cultural transits. Here I'm examining how migrant workers have acclimated and contributed to new cultural, but also linguistic contexts, how music might move with patterns of migration, how music plays in the maintenance of transnational identities, forging of social relations in the diaspora. And, I flashed the slide, but only to relate it to the context of one of my case studies, a caregiver who has been singing Filipino language lullabies and songs to her American employer's children, to the point that the children sing along with her in Filipino. In another case study, a caregiver told me that her elderly patients in London have, over the years, learned expressions that they overhear from her. And I'm interested in this transmission of culture that occurs through sound, through music, through voice. That is, on the one hand, how these migrant Filipinos learn to listen, enjoy, sometimes perform songs from their foreign workplace, and on the other, how their foreign employers learn to do so. And finally, terminologies and identities, before I wrap up. What I'm continually discovering is how these recordings reveal multiple and related facets of their identities. In recording of hours and hours of their work, caring for children or the elderly, we may designate them as simply caregivers, but these recordings sometimes reveal sounds of moments where these workers are considered a member of the family, a foster parent, a substitute daughter. And lastly, some recordings feature workers communicating with their loved ones back home in the Philippines through audio or video conversation, in this case, as wives and mothers. And this complexity of such intertwining identities, it's worth noting, were reinforced during a talk that the Filipino author Gina Apostol generously gave at an Asian American Studies seminar that I convened last year at a previous institution. Apostol came to read from her outstanding fiction novel titled Insurrecto, which explores the repercussions of the complicated colonial history of the Philippines. And one student in our class asked her how her migrant identity, she's now based in New York, has influenced her writing. Apostol remarked that migrant identities embody what she dubbed, quote, hyperhumanity, unquote. The human is always translating, she said. The human is always mediating, and these translations and mediations are more pronounced, more heightened, more hyper within the colonized and in a colonized place. And Apostol said that migrant identities as hyperhumans are always conscious of the translation and mediation occurring around them. A migrant identity embodying multiple senses of being, including in many ways, being a translated being. As an illustrative example, in one recording that I hope to share perhaps later on in another context with longer time, in one of my case studies in Milan, she was talking to her 3 children back home through Skype. And at the end of the conversation, she started talking to the recorder on her cell phone, in essence, to me, to us. And she said in Filipino, "You see, I'm not just a caregiver, I'm also a mother and a wife." Perhaps an embodiment of the way these workers negotiate these multiple aspects or facets of their identities, particularly in the environment and immediate surroundings, again, which serve as in a distinct manner as both their living and working spaces. I'm currently working on case studies in New Jersey, Milan, and London, but I've also found opportunities for the project to expand later on in other countries where there are also large populations of Filipina caregivers, in particular Saudi Arabia and Hong Kong. I've made some contact with workers who have over the years learned to speak Mandarin and Arabic and learn to enjoy, listen to, and sometimes sing Mandarin and Arabic music. In one particular compelling recording, a contact who works in Saudi Arabia, a Filipina caregiver is leaving the country after 35 years of employment, and she now speaks fluent Arabic, while the family she cares for, including 5 children who are now of adult age, now speak conversational Filipino. And in this recording, brief recording that we'll listen to, my contact generously shared to me, we can hear them saying their goodbyes to each other and interchanging Arabic and Filipino as they send her off at the airport. Just a few more slides before I close. Professor Pereñas, a Filipino-American professor of sociology and gender sexuality studies at USC, has done excellent work on Filipino domestic workers in the Middle East, especially those in the United Arab Emirates, where I was based as a journalist. And she calls attention to this legal infantilization of domestic workers. And perhaps if you have time later, I could relate it to Professor Choo's wonderful work. Yes, OFWs in Hong Kong, where there are more than 300,000 migrant Filipinos. Again, mostly women who work as household helpers and caregivers. There's certainly peripheral themes that have emerged alongside these issues that I hope to go deeper, like the perpetuation of inequalities of both formal and informal structures, stemming from the context of my case studies, again, relating to Professor Choo's work, but also the upcoming presenters. Infrastructure such as state policy, employers, NGOs, nonprofit organizations, the illegal visa economy, or a migration corridor built through chain migration pathway. These are sort of the themes that have emerged in the in-depth interviews that I conducted with some of my case studies after listening to their soundscapes. As affirmed by some of my caregiver respondents, a lack of knowledge of state policies has often led to the opening of a morally ambiguous space for such migrants to use informal channels to migrate out of their situation, even as these informal channels engender acute possibilities of their exploitation. And there's also much more to be said, certainly, as I close, inequalities that are gendered and how these forms of intimate labor affects perceptions of migrant women caregivers. Like my mother was a caregiver since I was 2, and she just recently stopped working due to health. But women like her are left most vulnerable in this monetized and heavily informal economy like caregiving. They have lesser chances of being employed outside their caregiving household, and it may be difficult for them to navigate and implicate themselves within overtly masculine trust networks in that migrant context, structures that inhibit integration, where caregivers are viewed primarily as temporary workers. How structural injustices are rarely mitigated and often reproduce in the process of their caregiving. I'm going to close there, and perhaps if there are questions about, methodology, etc., perhaps, please feel free to email me anytime, but we can also discuss it later on. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Thanks so much for that very evocative talk, James, and also for connecting it to Hae Yeon's talk as well. So I look forward to hearing you all in conversation with, as well as with the other two speakers, which we turn to now. So Rui Jie Peng.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for all your talk. So I'm going to also draw some connections, but today my talk is going to consist mainly of two parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about some of the major findings of my current research, which looks at older women who are ethnic minority Qiang members of China who do not move themselves, but their work in doing agricultural labor and also care work, and also their engagement with the government really offer support to enable their children to migrate and to work in the low wage and precarious sectors of the urban labor markets. And I will move on from there to think about some of the implications of this work and where it might possibly go forward. And I look forward to take advantage of the panel and to talk more about these aspects. So to briefly introduce the rural to urban migration that I study, in 2018, rural to urban migrant workers made up of 1/3 of China's labor force. They hail most from the country's rural areas and heading to the urban labor markets. They totaled about 280 million people. So that's one of the very large and maybe the largest labor migration around the world now. So Sichuan province is where I worked for my ethnographic work. It's one of the largest sources of rural to urban migrant workers. So particularly my ethnography takes place in the ethnic minority Qiang community that I call Changle, which is a very poor and marginalized village dominated by the Qiang ethnic minority groups. So since the 1990s, it has become an epitome of this sort of nationwide growing internal migration movement. But most research on labor migration in China and also around the world focuses on migrants themselves. So in China particularly, it focuses on Han majority migrants and how they earn remittances and send home money. But my research turns towards ethnic minority and those people, and especially women who do not migrate and who are often portrayed as left behind or passive receivers of remittances or as victims of this marketization and global economy. So I conducted 15 months of ethnographic work in the village, and I observed mainly those non-migrant Qiang women's daily labor practices, their community and civic engagement in Changle. So my dissertation really examines how these women leverage economic, social, and political strategies to garner resources and support migrant family members who are struggling in the precarious urban labor market. So I begin my inquiries by situating these Qiang women's daily labor practices in a historical and systematic account of social and economic changes that have taken place in China due to the state-led reforms and development policies. So the Chinese state development policies have shifted from, in the 1950s, from building a socialist modernity to the market reforms in the 1970s. And right now, it's a full-on expansion of agricultural commercialization, urbanization, and temporary non-agricultural work in the cities. So in the most recent phase, I find that the government initiatives to expand commercialized agriculture and urbanization, which happen in the areas where I work, has created many new challenges for ethnic minority and rural households. One of the challenges is the expansion of low wage and temporary and precarious migrant work in the cities, where most of the Qiang young migrants enter and take up the kind of work. And the second is that back in their hometowns, the older Qiang women who are their mothers of the migrants also confront ever-rising uncertainties regarding how to maintain productivity of the land and agricultural earning, because they really need the money to supplement and support the urban migrant workers. And why is the case? Well, in fact, one of my major findings is that many of the young migrant workers go to China knowing that they can hardly earn enough money to sustain themselves in living in the cities, because a lot of their earnings are not only low, uncertain, but a lot of them will go to support their day-to-day lives in the cities. So there is hardly anything that they can earn in surplus and bring back to homes, but most of the time they struggle to support themselves in the homes. And sometimes they will rely on the money that their parents and their mothers send to them from the countryside to sustain living in the urban areas. And one of the reasons they do it is because they aspire to participate in the kind of global economy that China has, and they want to get rid of the ethnic labels of them as backward, less developed, and not as not a part of this kind of globalized citizenship in China. So what happens is that in the private sphere, the older women who remain in the homes have had to take on increased labor burdens to earn supplemental incomes to help support the family's urban migrants. So they also, in addition to the agricultural labor, which they need to perform, they also need to do relation work to arrange finances and marriages for their adult migrant children so that the children can establish more stable lives. Since these older women have been adopting the state's development policies, they also need to take care of the offsprings of their children. So when the migrants move to the cities, they often leave their children to be taken care of by the grandmothers. So the grandmothers are really pressured to raise not only healthy children, but also attend to the education and the cultivation of the grandchildren. So they have very intense care work and caregiving work that they need to do. So meanwhile, these older Chan women have used I found that they have used this kind of gendered reproductive labor that they engage with as integral parts of the strategies they use to engage with the local state political actors to demand better resources for their families. So what they do is that they engage in interactive and political bargaining with the multiple bureaucracies of the authoritarian state in China to influence the distribution of benefits under China's poverty alleviation programs. So one of my chapters looks at how these older women leverage the gendered expectations of them to care for their families, to earn wage, and to bring resources to sustain their families. They leverage those cultural expectations to engage with government officials and perform what I call as rightful bargaining. So what they do is they appear very not threatening to the authoritarian state and also exploit the state's rhetoric and divisions, which the state wants to provide and to help these marginalized groups. So they exploit this kind of dynamics to demand better resources for their families. So these are some of the major findings that I have from my fieldwork from 2018 to 2019. And since then, there are many changes that have taken place, but many aspects of the life also remain unchanged. So in 2020, as the coronavirus spreads across China, the state imposed a near total shutdown of the economy, and there were very strict restrictions on people's mobilities. So to curb the spread of the virus, the state for the first time restricted migrants from traveling back to their rural hometowns for the Spring Festival in 2020. So the majority of the migrant workers that I work with in Changle, they often go to other cities in Sichuan province. So they were able to some extent to travel back to their homes because Sichuan province at that time wasn't the frontier of the coronavirus outbreak. So only several people from the village were in more coastal provinces and they were more affected, but the longer impacts of the coronavirus lingered on. So many migrant workers who had returned home could not return to work in a typical as in a typical year because the service industry was experiencing frequent shutdowns and reduced capacity. Like in the US, many migrant workers were notified that they couldn't return to work, so they remained in their rural homes for a long time in 2020. So by April 2020, one research participant told me over a social media app that he was waiting to see if he could return to Chengdu, which is the which is a major city, to work. And he was living with his parents, getting a lot of support from home. So in June was usually the season when the major cash crop, which is the plums from the village, were ready for sale. So many families had troubles finding buyers because the economy has slowed down, and a lot of consumers in the urban cities were hesitant to spend money on those specialty fruits that the Changle people were cultivating in their rural homes. So there were a lot of uncertainties and a pervasive economic contraction in China. The COVID-19 pandemic only added to the kind of already existing precarity and uncertainties that those migrant families in Changle were experiencing. And there were some of the unexpected events and changes that can easily tip the fragile balance between rural households and the urban migrant workers. So another change in 2020 is that the state introduced major changes to stop the development policy, which is the poverty alleviation program in Changle. This targeted poverty alleviation program started in China in 2014, and it was originally trying to target especially the poor ethnic minority home regions to help them develop their economy. But in 2020, it was the three-year poverty alleviation battle, which the government wanted to put on and to end absolute poverty in China, all over China by 2020. So sure enough, in November 2020, China announced that it has eradicated poverty, and many of the policies to support the families and to give them subsidies have also stopped in Changle. So I was wondering, what would happen to households' income if the government stopped providing cash transfers, subsidies, or healthcare to these people in need? And could some of the households who are also moved outside of the rural areas to be relocated in urban towns and other places find jobs and resume their economic activities? So this study offers a glimpse into what I want to see is the state-led development programs, and also how these programs are laying the future possibilities for economic development for the ethnic minority households. And I also identify that the state's development policies in many ways have been either explicit or implicit to define the standards of modernity and progress, while demarcating the Chang and other ethnic minority groups as backward, unmodern, and less developed, and in need of development assistance. So as a result, there is this continuous flow of migration and aspiration to migrate, because people want to get rid of these labels and they long for a more modern mainstream of life to participate in the Han, or in the global economy of China. So as these Chang migrants and their families continue to move back or between rural and urban locations, they have to contend with the kind of continued precarity that is born out of the rural agricultural changes and the urban labor market. So here, I want to take advantage of the panel to think about how my current work might relate to future work, and also thinking about state migration and precarious work. So as I explored the kind of gendered labor that was sustaining the rural households and urban migrant workers, so the kind of very everyday agricultural care work that the women are doing, I noticed that the environment the natural environment, or the land, plays a really important role in enabling some of the essential work that women needed to do to maintain the social reproduction of their families. But the environment in the ethnic minority hometowns is undergoing a lot of transformations. On the one hand, state-led development initiatives are exploiting natural resources to pursue economic development and ethnic tourism. And at the same time, the Chinese state is dealing with the consequences of many years of industrial development and environmental degradation. So the government is also promoting discourses of achieving ecological civilization to enforce environmental conservation in those Western regions, which is the home to the ethnic minority people. So as these projects go on to commercialize the livelihoods, but at the same time limit the use of land and certain activities that people can engage in, those households will surely see more precarious patterns of agricultural production and waged work. So apart from the natural environment that is going through changes, there are also alarming changes in Chinese society about fertility decline, and also the changes in the downturn in human fertilities across Chinese society. And I think these are really linked questions, because one is the fertility of the land and another is that of people. So this year in China, the state has been alarmed by the low birth rate, which is the lowest on record in contemporary China. And it has ripple effects on how the child rearing practices will continue to be carried out in the families, also in the Chang ethnic minority families, the future shortage of adult labor force, uncertainties in migration patterns, and also changing ethnic composition of the population. So China has just responded by relaxing the birth control policy to allow for the birth of a third child to a family. So 3 children policy instead of one child or 2 children policy. So the Chang households in Changle I work with were also not immune to these changes. As I noted before, many households have struggled to maintain the high monetary and emotional investments that they needed to invest in the future generation of their grandchildren. So what might emerge from these changes is an intriguing interaction between fertility management of people and of the land. And this involves both how the state actively tries to shape the future productivity of the environment and of its population, and as well as how people, especially those of marginalized ethnic minority groups and women among them, negotiate the state initiatives and the everyday realities of maintaining viable livelihoods and social reproduction. And that social reproduction is really essential in supporting the kind of rural to urban migration in China, where the cities in China are surely going to see higher needs of workers, especially in the low wage sectors, to provide care worker for the aging population and to do other essential work. So as these young ethnic minority people continue to migrate to cities to supplement these kind of works, I think these changes will have far implications for a broader systems of inequality. I still hope that I can continue to work on this, and I would love to hear feedback from other panelists and other participants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rui Jie, for that important look at internal migration. And also, I appreciate you bringing it up to date too, because I know you have been working there for a long time. And the challenges are both new and similar, as you say. I am happy to welcome Kamran Ali, who has now been able to join us, who's professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. And he will be moderating after we hear from Andrea Wright.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Michelle and Kamran, for the invitation. And thank you so much to the other panelists. This was a really generative set of papers, and I've really enjoyed listening to it. When I was preparing for this, I began to wonder, what does it mean to be a hero? And I was thinking about exceptional individuals doing great things. And in the context of migration, this often emerges in ideas around helping families, developing communities, modernizing the nation, as we just heard about, I think, really well. And I also began to wonder, what does heroism elide? So how does the heroic celebration of the individual support structural inequality, which is also something I've heard us discussing a bit. And what I want to offer here is some perspectives from my work on Indian labor migration to the Arabian or Persian Gulf, depending on your perspective. So in 2010, I was in Uttar Pradesh, which is a state in northeastern India, with Deepak. And Deepak was there to hire workers for an oil company based in the Middle East. Now, Deepak himself was from Uttar Pradesh, and he had left Uttar Pradesh about a decade ago when he himself had found a job in the Gulf through a recruiting agent. After working in the Gulf for about 6 years, he moved to Mumbai, which is a city in India, where he began to work as a recruiting agent. And recruiting agents here act as intermediaries between oil companies and migrants, and they help in particular navigate India's immigration restrictions and regulations. As we talked about our trip, Deepak described his work as a way to allow other men, and I'm going to translate, a chance to live the dream. Now, Deepak is a questionable hero. Often recruiting agents are thought of as perhaps unscrupulous individuals who are selling people abroad for a life of misery. But from another perspective, from the perspective of his family, he could be thought of as a hero. Many migrant laborers to the Gulf go to the Gulf from states like Uttar Pradesh, where the per capita income is half of the national average. Based on past experience, Deepak expected that in Uttar Pradesh, he would be able to hire at a pay rate much lower than many Indians will accept the hundreds of workers that the oil company wanted to hire on this trip. One of the men interviewed by Deepak on this trip was Ahmed. Ahmed lived on a farm with his parents, his brother, his brother's wives, his nieces, his nephews, and his sister. As I spoke with Ahmed, he explained to me that there were few jobs in the area and that the farm did not produce enough food to meet his family's needs. The family was heavily in debt to a local moneylender who charged a high interest rate. In addition, Ahmed's eldest sister, Nahid, needed to get married, but the family did not have the resources to provide the funds for her to do so. Ahmed's parents wanted him to go to the Gulf to earn money, help support the family, and contribute to his sister's marriage. Many of Ahmed's friends already worked in the Gulf, and he saw it as his duty, as both a son and a brother, so it's masculine gendered work, to go abroad. He reflected, quote, "My friends have gone, I also must go," unquote. After his interview, he and I walked through his village, and he pointed to his neighbor's new paka house, or a house made of concrete and bricks. And in front of the house was a tractor. The neighbors had bought the house and the tractor after 2 sons in the family had begun working in the Gulf. And Ahmed told me he did not want to be, quote, left behind, unquote, as those from his village migrated and improved their living conditions. Now, Ahmed here is perhaps a better example of a hero. And he connects with Hae Yeon's work insofar as this is gendered, and also it's discussed by Rui Jie, and I talk about it in other places in my work. Women's work at home, which support this migration, is not celebrated, but Ahmed is. And he's seen as helping to modernize his family, helping to modernize his village. Today, there are approximately 8.5 million Indians living in Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. These countries have large non-national populations, and non-citizens make up the majority of their workforces. Indians work at all levels of the Gulf economy, excuse me, from CEOs to laborers, but the majority of them hold unskilled and semi-skilled positions. Now, unskilled and semi-skilled are categories used by the Indian government historically from the colonial period through the present as a way of classifying workers. And unskilled workers usually refer to manual laborers, and semi-skilled workers have some technical training, which usually includes positions such as drivers, could be a welder, a plumber, a bar bender, a mason, perhaps. Like James Sullivan discussed in his presentation, migrants are often celebrated by heroes not only by their families, but also by the government. And in 2019, India's Prime Minister opened the annual celebration of migration, called that year, "The Role of the Indian Diaspora in Building New India." And in this opening, he said in a mixture of English and Hindi, and I'll translate here, "You are India's brand ambassadors," and he's speaking to Indians abroad. "You are symbols of India's capacities and capabilities," unquote. The Indian government's interest in this brand image of India reflects the ways in which the language of business and marketing are used to inform migration policies and practices. Prime Minister Modi's emphasis on capacities and capabilities also invokes a future of the country, a future built on India's greatest resource, its citizens' potential. The capacities and capabilities celebrated by Modi are not only the skills migrants learn, but the entrepreneurial spirit of migration. Often, a view of migrants in India by government officials or recruiting agents is very similar to what Michel Foucault described as migration is an investment. The migrant is an investor. He is an entrepreneur of himself who incurs expenses by investing to obtain some kind of improvement. And that's a direct quote of Foucault. Of course, not all migrants are good representatives of India. In order to protect Indians abroad who might be taken advantage of by their employers, and to protect India's brand image or reputation abroad, Indian government officials impose immigration regulations, and these particularly apply to people who haven't passed through 10th grade, who most often will go for these unskilled or semi-skilled positions. To navigate regulations, companies and migrants often work with recruiting agents, and migrants themselves borrow large sums of money to migrate. While paying sums in excess of the legal amount is illegal or irregular, often, having the, I guess it's also thought of as entrepreneurial, because central to this concept of an entrepreneurial migrant is the assumption that migrants are rational economic actors. In conversations, recruiting agents regularly emphasize migration as an economic calculus. So one recruiting agent said to me, quote, "People primarily go overseas for earning a living, saving, and sending it back," unquote. And usually it's, everyone agrees that working in the Gulf pays 2 to 3 times what someone might make in India. In addition to higher wages, when discussing reasons for migration, government officials, recruiting agents, and employers in the Gulf regularly point to the possibilities for upward mobility for workers. So if a worker works hard, he can get a better position. This understanding of migrants as making an economic calculus fits within understandings of migration that understand it to be the result of supply and demand, or surplus and scarcity to common economic models. India has a surplus of people, I'm often told, but a scarcity of wealth. In contrast, the Gulf has a scarcity of labor, but a surplus of oil. These types of models dominate discussions of labor and oil historically and today. So within this economic framework of surplus and scarcity, Indian government officials, recruiting agents, and oil company managers conceptualize migrants as entrepreneurs and rational actors making rational choices. Migrants are improving themselves. They sacrifice their time at home with family to bring a better quality of life to their families and communities. But this entrepreneurial perspective also lends itself to a logic in which, when things don't work out, the failures are seen as exceptional, and the failures are seen to be found in individuals. They're not seen as failures within the system. Celebrating the heroic entrepreneurial migrant also hides the experiences. And I think that if we look at the process of migration, we can see the cracks in this discursive construct. Many young men, like Ahmed, dream of migrating to the Gulf, and they borrow large sums of money, often at high interest rates from money lenders, to do so. But once they're in the Gulf, men find the work physically and emotionally difficult. Working on oil projects often requires physically exhausting work and long hours. Most men work outside, and the summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. In addition, labor laws favor employers, and workers are legally forbidden to unionize or strike for better working conditions. Some workers in the Gulf face even greater challenges, including not being paid for their labor, not being able to return home when they choose, physical abuse, and injury or death while on the job. Indeed, worker deaths are not uncommon, and on average, between 2012 and 2018, 10 Indians died daily in the Gulf. In a village outside of Hyderabad, I met Rani, a young mother whose husband had died while working in the Gulf. Rani, her husband, and her mother-in-law had borrowed large amounts of money to facilitate Rani's husband's migration and used the family's farm as a guarantee on the loan. Before her husband's death, Rani used the money her husband had sent from the Gulf for household expenses and to make payments on the large debt the family had incurred to facilitate her husband's migration. Despite regular payments, the debt was borrowed from a local moneylender at a high interest rate, and the family still owed the majority of the debt. After her husband's death, Rani and her mother-in-law continued to work on the farm, but they were forced to borrow additional money for daily expenses. Throughout the years that I've known them, their debt has continued to grow, and I've known them for about 12 years now. Crushing debt is also accrued by men who are injured on job sites in the Gulf, a debt exacerbated by those injured because those who are injured do not regularly receive compensation for workplace injuries. In a village close to Rani's and also in near Hyderabad in India, I met Latika. Her husband Darsh had worked in the Gulf as a laborer for 8 months. but his employer had sent him home after an accident on the job site caused an injury that no longer allowed Darsh to work. When he returned to India, Latika told me the people who lent him money, quote, tortured him by harassing him and asking for payments on the loan, unquote. According to Latika, Darsh could neither work nor pay his debts, and this led him to commit suicide. These experiences bring to the fore the disposability of individuals within this model of scarcity and surplus. In the case of Indians who migrate to the Gulf, as families struggle to eat, workers are killed on job sites, and individuals commit suicide in the face of seemingly insurmountable debts. Too often, these very avoidable debts are ignored. In other cases, the debt are blamed for not acting as proper rational actors or not properly modernizing. And for example, one example of this is in the Gulf, a company doesn't need to pay money to a family if a person is killed or injured working on a job site if they're seen not to be wearing their safety gear properly and they've been told how to do it already. So, of course, this debt and difficult labor conditions are not unique and they exist globally. In his book, Brutalism, Achille Mbembe explicitly connects the extraction of resources, colonialism, and what he calls the brutalization of social relations, or the commodification of social relations, the subjugation and violation of bodies, and the naturalization and reification of difference. Brutalism enables the necropolitical aims of the state. Here, I'm focusing on how resource extraction has become increasingly violent and is imbricated with the state. Often we think about it in armed forces and the police, but also in things like immigration regulations. In such contexts, necropolitics uses the logic of difference to order populations that are deemed dangerous. In the process, racialized bodies are excluded from spaces in which they are not wanted, and this is maintained by surveillance and technologies. One result is that the erection of borders creates spaces that certain classes are unable to traverse, and such borders are maintained through such things as prohibitions on collective action. Within this context, migrants borrow money to migrate, and in particular, to navigate borders. These debts, while illegal to charge the sums, are seen as making a cost-benefit analysis and are situated as heroic migrants who are improving their country and helping their families. And here, just to conclude quickly, a perspective on migrants, which considers them a hero, abstracts the commodification of labor and assumes entrepreneurial risk calculations by migrants. The experiences of migrants and attention to the process of migration, in contrast, questions this frictionless role of labor and demonstrates how precarious labor complicates the commodity chain. And what I want to point to are ways in which these narratives of hero rely on individuality that hides structural inequalities and violence. Understanding migrants as rational actors operating within an economic model becomes a rhetoric device used to produce economies with systems of value in which labor is cheap and oil expensive. These reinforce wealth inequalities and place the greatest risk onto the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. Thank you so much. And before I start, I want to first apologize to everyone for not being here on time. I don't want to go into the details. It was, anyway, I was stuck somewhere and couldn't get back. So I do apologize, but thank you all for coming and joining, and especially thank to Karen for sort of, taking on the task of introducing all of you and bringing everything together. Karen has also been very kind to sort of send me notes on the first two presentations, Professor Choo and Professor Gabrillo. I'm so sorry I couldn't hear, but I did hear Rui Jie and Dr. Wright's presentation, and thank you. I actually at this stage don't have much to say, except primarily also because I'm half knowledgeable, as it were, but we'll definitely try to open up the discussion, and there are some questions in the chat, and colleagues are, and I would encourage everyone to please, listening to all of you, and also Karen, again, thank you. And if in any way I'm misrepresenting papers, do forgive me. But there's a larger question around, I think, Andrea rightly pointed out this whole notion of heroism and hero, and also the gendered notion of these issues. But I was just thinking about migration and movement of people, and the forced. I mean, apart from, of course, the history of the Atlantic slave trade is part of that movement for migration. But even if you look at 19th century and the way indentured laborers were brought into the British colony in the Caribbean and East Africa, and even in Southeast Asia and other places from India, but also how labor, especially from China and from the broader Pacific, was brought in, and from Japan and other places, whether for various kinds of infrastructure work in these United States. I mean, that history, of course, we know, and the sad history we know. We also know of the struggles of those people who were forced into these labor regimes, and especially from a South Asian perspective, we not only in terms of organizing in the early 20th century by Punjabi and Sikh migrants in the Pacific coast, but also organizing for anti-colonial movements that the Sikhs had in terms of the Ghadar party and those kinds of things. So there's a long history of that. I'm also reminded a little bit about that we, especially in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of literature on especially the southern part of Africa, from places like Lesotho and other places, where entire villages had to go into mining, had to migrate, and villages were mostly populated by either the elderly, the children, or women. And the way in which I won't say empowerment, it was a big word in the 80s, and women's empowerment, but the way in which spaces were opened, and my friend Neville would know this, of course, being from there, but the spaces that were open for women to participate in various kinds of take more responsibility for the household, which was also precarious, because a lot of times there was a history of abandonment, right? People would just go, and the whole history of shebeens and the kind of ways that women would participate in rural economies was, and I saw that also in the early 90s working in Egypt, where entire large portions, especially in the Delta, in fact, men would be in what Dr. Wright was talking about, the Persian or the Arab Gulf. And one of the things, of course, the precarity, the indebtedness and all that was there, but there were also there was a certain kind of they would come to me and say, and they would always assume I was under some kind of a project, which I wasn't, that why can't you bring my husband back to this project? Because there was a certain kind of a sense of loss and a certain kind of an affective missing of, and which was also very interesting, because when we look at gendered roles in the Middle East, it's always about masculinity and patriarchy. But over here, there was a sort of a demonstration of love and affection for one who was like for 2-3 years in the fields of Saudi Arabia or Dubai or Kuwait and things. So there are various kinds of issues. And in the Middle East, it's also a history. I'm going on and on, but I'll stop in a bit. There's also a longer history. I mean, in the early 60s, you find South Asian and North and even Middle Eastern, at least Egyptian and Libyan laborers in the oil fields of Algeria. I mean, there are all these sort of ways in which this issue. Coming to some of the work that that Dr. Gabrillo and Professor Choo may have suggested, I think it's fascinating in the way in which, not fascinating, sad. I mean, the South Korean example of Southeast Asian women and South Asian men and the kind of hierarchies there. But also it goes back to the history of Philippines and American presence there during, especially for the bases, right? And the kind of tensions there and the whole sort of Subic Bay and all that. I mean, a lot of work has been done ethnographically as well around the sex work and different kind of emotional work that women were used, right? Or participated in, if not, were very much part of. And I think it's really interesting that history is repeating itself in various ways in South Korea. With in these, I mean, the South Asian men, whether in Japan or Korea or even in China now, it's a history that's still unfolding, and the kind of ways in which visa regimes are allowing them to participate or not, or whether they can bring family or not. There's a whole sort of gray area, even in China, even in southeastern China, and you know, there's a lot of South Asians there doing all kinds of work, which is under the radar, which comes to, of course, to Regine's work, which is, you know, enough cannot be said about the kind of ways in which the Chinese poor have, whether they can go to the, you know, migrate to the cities or not, or whether what is happening in rural China, whether the ways in which rural China can produce enough or give the kind of such, but also even Chinese rural and urban poor have started to migrate, or there's to places like Singapore and Malaysia, and a lot of women are trapped in this kind of sex work and other kinds of low-level work. So it's really it's something which is not always it's now slowly and gradually, perhaps in Regi's work it'll come out more, but slowly and gradually you start seeing it in depictions in cinema, in fiction, in different kinds of you know, artistic or aesthetic representation. There is a certain kind of way in which these things are coming forward. I don't have much to say except that there were some questions which which colleagues can ask themselves rather than me paraphrasing them. But one general thing was, and this is for Professor Choo, in terms of you know, do South Korean labor activists work with South Asian men on the basis as well? And what is the sort of the way in which organizing happens? Interestingly enough, this panel sort of works very well with the panel yesterday on care, but earlier panel and what we'll be working on informality. And I could say more about that tomorrow, in which the whole idea of this whole informal sector being the more dominant form of labor in the global South. And how does that mean in terms of the future of politics, in terms of the working poor? So that's a broader question that, Professor Choo, if you may want to respond to that, but then others could also start asking. Sorry, I took on more time for a person who didn't hear everyone, so I apologize.
Kamran, can I just interject?
Sure.
Actually, my question, and there was actually a way by which I was trying to have, the question was actually meant for both Hae Yeon and Andrea, in terms of thinking about larger global processes of oil extraction, military bases, and the ways by which these engender particular forms of guest worker programs, within which South Asian migrants, certainly in US military bases in South Korea, are located. And so my question was, at some level, trying to get a conversation going on between Hae Yeon and Andrea.
That's really great, yeah.
Having Hae Yeon comment a little bit on the presence of military bases and what that does for labor organizing, and whether that might be an anxiety for not organizing hostesses or sex workers, right? And other kinds of South Asian men who are always engaged in all kinds of informal, if you will, or low-wage labor.
Yeah. No, Sharmila, thank you. And I think that would be a best way to start it. I mean, when you say this, I also remember, think about, you know, historically that around these kinds of economies always developed around British cantonment in colonial era as well, right? I mean, all the kinds of ways, and especially the sort of different kind, but also around sex work. But go ahead, please. I think your question would be the better one because it starts a conversation. So I'll keep quiet.
That's a really great question. I think just a little bit of clarification around the American military bases in South Korea. it overlaps with these factory towns where South Asian and Southeast Asian men and women factory workers, where they are. But in the club district itself, I mean, it's not that it's always had very clear boundary, but the club district, because it has different temporal dimension, right? It opens only at night, and then things like that. So the Filipina women and a smaller number of Russian former Soviet women, they are kind of in that kind of separate segregated space. And then the migrant factory workers from South Asia, from Southeast Asia, along with American GIs, they often come to these clubs as customers. They sometimes have different hours for them, and sometimes they don't, and there are conflicts between them. So the point about having American military presence in South Korea, Jin Kyung Lee, who's a faculty member in UC San Diego, who's a cultural critique, she has a really very insightful take on how to understand American military in South Korea. It used to be kind of the embodiment of the American empire, the American, like they can do anything, they have such a amazing, money they can spend. In 1950s, 60s, until 70s, American military, the money that they brought, it really formed the camptown economy to a great degree. However, since the rise of the Asian economies, including South Korea, since the 80s and later, now Jin Kyung Lee says the role that the American military plays is actually not that different from, it's another form of militarized migrant labor. They are there to serve South Korean state, South Korean capital, in a way that is a very different meaning. So the way that these American military, they're actually in a way not that different from other migrant factory or club workers in that setting where they're also segregated. So that's an interesting kind of new trend.
Could I jump in and maybe?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Choo.
Yeah, no, I guess my jumping in is kind of to build upon what Dr. Choo just said and then ask a question about that. So in my historic work on Indian labor migration to the Gulf, one of the interesting things we find is that like increasingly there's these labor hierarchies that are built over the course of the 20th century. And so, and one of the reasons is like in the so oil projects like military bases actually often have like certain set amounts of time that they want people working there. And so it's easier to hire foreign laborers who don't have any recourse to like the state and don't have any rights if they go on a strike, because you can just fire them when the project's over, right? Because if you're going to build a refinery, you need lots of people, you need thousands of workers, but after the refinery is built, you only need 100 or something to keep it going. And it's similar with like building a military base requires a lot, and there's this mobility, I think, of military bases, at least in the Middle East, that I saw reflected a lot, that like seemed to resonate a lot with oil projects. And so I was thinking about like how guest worker programs, really have a debt to these temporalities of oil production or perhaps military movement. But the other thing I find in my historic work is that in the 1940s, we see Indian workers going on strike alongside with Farsi-speaking workers and Arabic-speaking workers. Like, so workers from Iran and Yemen or Aden and Lebanon or Palestine will all strike together. But by the 1960s, strikes are really becoming increasingly segmented. And today, if you do happen to see a strike, often they're very much segmented along national lines. They're very rare though, because they're also illegal. And so I guess my question is like, when you were talking about these borders, like how, once people transgress these like ethnic borders, I was thinking more, I guess, of the physical ones or, perhaps conceptual, do you see these understandings of difference to be increasing, like, along with this nativism that you were talking about in your speech or in your talk, or do you see them as perhaps have a longer historical trajectory due to, perhaps other politics in Southeast Asia?
That's a great question. What I see in my fieldwork is that the ethnic divide certainly exists among migrant workers, and partly the religious divide as well. But in the case of factory workers, because they're in very constant interaction with different South Korean civil society actors that mobilize them as now you are migrant workers, right? So they develop a identity as migrant workers that transcend, I'm Filipino. I mean, I know that that person is not me. We're the diligent group. They're not, that rhetoric certainly exists within the community, but when they come to the protests, when they come to immigration, the anti-immigration raid rally, then all those rhetorics drop, right? Then they're migrant workers. In the case of when there's no way to mobilize them in those umbrellas, then in the case of club workers, then those ethnic divides remain much more strong. It's a contextual, I find.
Are there other questions? I think, thank you so much. No, I mean, also historically, and this is thinking with you, Dr. Wright, I mean, historically in the 40s in the oil fields of, or British-dominated oil fields of Iran, there may be also ways in which the anti-colonial, I mean, there were huge strikes, right? And also to the Communist Party and different, Asif Bayat writes about it, and even Kaveh Ahsani. So it's a very different one. The issue is the current nation state in the Gulf, right? I mean, the way in which anti-labor laws and the way in which you yourself describe the way in which various kinds of visa regimes sort of control it. And I'm sure it's similar in Northeast Asia in terms of Cairo, in terms of Korea and other places in Japan. So I think there is the issue of Palestinians and people from Aden and from South Asia. One thing I do see with working in the Middle East and other places that not with everything, and I think Dr. Choo is right, that there are ethnic and sectarian and religious divides, but there's also for the first time people coming from these small villages in Uttar Pradesh or from outside Cairo or something, they have a certain sense of a cosmopolitanism in terms of, what do you eat and how wedding rituals are somewhere else. And there's a different kind of world is also culturally constructed. I don't know if it goes on to becoming a kind of organizing around rights and struggle for that, because the oppression of these Gulf states and different, Anyway, other questions? Sharmila, you had more, friend, that you wanted to, or anyone else wants to speak?
No, I'm done with my questions. Thanks.
Okay, but others had other questions for, yes, please, Andrea. And Nina Ebner, you wanted to say something, and then Dr. Wright, you could. Go ahead, Nina.
Oh, I just had a question. It's for Rui Jie, but other folks can also jump in if they want. And I guess what I'm wondering is I found your work to be really interesting. This whole panel is super generative. And I wonder how you see your work kind of complicating or expanding our understandings of social reproduction, especially in the way you think about, or maybe even theorize, or maybe you want to talk more about this, livelihood strategies outside of the home as socially reproductive. And that I'd really be interested in learning more kind of how you're thinking about that in your work.
And who are you directing it to? I'm sorry, Nina.
Rui Jie.
Okay, Rui Jie. Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear that. No, it's my fault. Please, Rui Jie, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the question. So yeah, traditionally a lot of work has understood social reproductive work as the work that women do inside of the households. So for doing care work or the kind of everyday household labor that is unpaid and sort of supporting the daily lives of social reflection. What I wanted to add to that is also highlighting that these very women who were already doing this kind of work are also now taking on a large part of the agricultural labor, which is the main source of household income for many of those households. So as I was talking about, a lot of households' strategy was to send migrants to the urban centers to earn money, and that was kind of viable in the 1990s, or perhaps all the way to 2000s when the men were kind of doing a longer term of construction work or other kind of construction labor in the cities. But right now, the kind of work that the younger migrants are doing in the urban centers are really precarious and doesn't add that much or a lot to the remittances or income for the household. So what ends up happening is that I'm seeing that the kind of work that women do in the productive realm, even in engaging with different market agents or other, like middlemen who come to buy their crops or other people, as contributing to social reproduction, because they're using that money or the income from the agricultural labor to as resources to sustain their families. And I think it's interesting that Kamran was just talking about, or Sharmila was also mentioning, whether it's kind of empowering women that they're moving from the household to a much more public role of earning income. I think in a way that it does empower them, and a lot of the women really take a lot of pleasure and pride in becoming the earners of their households and being able to generate this money, which is a really material and visible marker of their capacity, of their capability to support their families, versus the kind of invisible, unpaid and unrecognized care labor and everyday labor that they're doing. So they take a lot of pride in it, but at the same time, I do not want to simply think that they are empowered because they're making a lot of money, because at the same time, they are still embedded in the cultural expectations to perform the added labor that is required for them to do in the home. So especially in the absence of the migrants, they are taking on the work to bring up the grandchildren. And in my work, I was highlighting that they themselves feel very increased expectation to do more intensive. So in the West, you will say intensive mothering, but I'm saying that they're doing very intensive grandmothering for the children, because now in the modernizing or globalizing Chinese society, they want the children to be well educated and to be like healthy citizens. So they're not just raising children like they were raising their own children, but they are bringing up those more competent or capable citizens of China. So I think, as you said, the social reproduction kind of work is expanding, but in some respects, the nature and how it's valued is still complicated, I think.
Thank you so much. We're at 2:30 Central Time, but Dr. Wright, you had a question, and I'll give you the last word before I thank everyone. Or you raise your hands. Or
I was curious from both Rui Jie as well as James about like this, what was the understanding of like being a good citizen or being a modernity? Is that the same as like those state narratives that are told, or are there variations? Are there ways that when workers are migrating, they're imagining a different type of modernity? Or when women are packing care boxes, what kinds of representations are they sending, or what sounds do they send, to represent those spaces?
Well, we'll ask James Gabrillo to answer, because we haven't heard from him after his presentation. Please, you'll have the last word, friend. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Wright. And I actually wanted to relate that to that nice phrase that you brought up in the chat about good brand representatives of the country of origin. It seems that this narrative of Bagong Bayani, the new heroes that emerged in the 90s, that's narrative directed by the state, specifically referring to domestic workers, women domestic workers. This is sort of a narrative that is very powerful and influential back home in the Philippines, but when you're outside, when you're in these migrant countries, and when I was a journalist in the UAE, I worked with the Philippine consulate a lot on labor issues, where there's this prioritization, if that's the right word, for doctors, for engineers, for lawyers, for teachers. And again, there's a sense of gendered labor there. but you had caregivers, domestic workers, service crew coming to us, the daily newspaper, instead of the consulate. When we'd ask it, it's because they'd say, well, we're too many, they wouldn't listen to us. Or maybe if we were journalists. So there's this, what is a good brand representative from a Philippine standpoint? Back home, it's these women who are doing these labor care jobs. But when you're in that migrant context, there are these globalized colonial narratives of what a good employee here. And again, returning to that point that I made about gendered labor, in Abu Dhabi, for example, that latter group happens to be a gendered woman's profession.
Yeah, no, thank you. And there are some questions here that we couldn't get to, but if our panelists would want to stay back for 4 or 5 minutes, or others want to discuss, because people have to leave. It's 2:30 Central Time. I like Nina Ebner, you're reminding us of that. I mean, I date myself, but you used to have all these things, production and reproduction kind of titles, and you sort of, for various reasons, it still matters, right? And the whole issue of the rural sector and women's work and things, and I think Rui, you basically also, all of you. So formally, I want to thank the panelists, Dr. Choo, Dr. Wright, Dr. Gabrillo, Rui Jie. Please, thank you so much for, and if you want to stay back and others want to stay back, that's fine. We are here for another 5-10 minutes. Otherwise, I know people have to go. And I want to thank my friend, colleague, Karen, for helping us out here. I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Thank you for coming. And yeah, so if people want to stay back for 5-10 minutes, we'll be happy to. Others can leave. I mean, the time is up.